The MSIA Project, 3 Degrees to L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. A narrative history of Hubbard's formation, Scientology's rise, and the spread of its methods and mythology into later spiritual movements, seminar cultures, and independent offshoots. Prologue. The House on Orange Grove. Long before Scientology became a church, a litigation machine, a scandal magnet, or a word spoken with a mixture of fascination and alarm, there was a rented house in Pasadena. It was the sort of house into which a century seemed to have emptied its props. Engineers wandered through it. Occultists wandered through it. Manuscripts, diagrams, uniforms, and ceremonial implements crossed the same tabletops. In one room there were ideas about rockets. In another, ideas about angels, will, sex, hidden masters, and the architecture of initiation. The future, as America imagined it after the Second World War, seemed to have split itself into 2 equally extravagant dreams: the conquest of outer space and the conquest of inner space. In that house, for a brief and combustible period, both dreams lived together. Jack Parsons, brilliant, reckless, and mythic in his own lifetime, embodied one side of the dream. He was a founder of modern rocketry and a devotee of Aleister Crowley's Thelema, a religion of will, ritual, and esoteric ascent. L. Ron Hubbard, younger and already practiced in reinvention, embodied the other side. He was a pulp writer, a spinner of grand claims, a man fascinated by mind, trauma, power, destiny, and narrative control. When Hubbard entered Parsons's orbit in the mid-1940s, he entered not just a household, but an atmosphere. It was an atmosphere of experiment. Nothing seemed impossible if one had enough nerve to say it aloud. A man might summon a goddess, build a rocket, or rewrite the grammar of the human psyche. America had just watched science win a war and destroy cities. It was prepared to believe almost anything about technique. That is the setting in which the history of Scientology begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like an American synthesis. Hubbard did not invent from nothing the idea that human beings might be repaired through a technology of spirit. He inherited a nation already crowded with therapeutic promises, mail-order occultism, positive thinking schemes, psychological fads, and metaphysical religions. He inherited the pulps, where language learned to move quickly, simplify conflict, and turn every abstract difficulty into a serial adventure. He inherited wartime trauma and post-war anxiety, and a public newly primed to seek methods for mastering memory, fear, and emotional pain. He inherited the modern prestige of science and the older American conviction that salvation should be practical, immediate, and available by means of a method. He also inherited the occult underground. That inheritance did not make Scientology simply a disguised occult order. That claim is too simple. But it did mean that when Hubbard later moved from the relatively democratic promises of Dianetics toward the more secretive, hierarchical, and graded universe of Scientology, he was not inventing without precedent. He had seen what an initiatory ladder looked like. He had seen the power of confidential teachings, arcane vocabulary, staged advancement, and the charisma of hidden knowledge. He had seen how a leader could stand at the center of a map that made the visible world seem like only the first layer of reality. This story is therefore not only about L. Ron Hubbard and the religion he built. It is about transmission. It is about how a set of ideas, practices, styles, and organizational tricks moved outward from one man and one movement into a much wider field. Some of those later movements openly emerged from Scientology or from people trained in it. Some denied the connection. Some took only the form and abandoned the cosmology. Some kept the ladder and lost the space opera. Some kept the confessional technique and renamed it. Some preserved the founder drama and buried the original founder. Some were 1 degree away. Some were 2. Some were 3. By the time Hubbard's influence had passed through Eckankar, EST, the seminar culture, and the broken archipelago of ex-Scientology, it had become harder to see, but not harder to feel. The story that follows is not a conspiracy chart. It is a genealogy. Genealogies are messier than accusations. They do not say that every resemblance proves theft. They do not pretend that one tradition explains everything about another. Paul Twitchell cannot be understood without Sant Mat and Radhasoami. John Roger cannot be understood without the metaphysical Christianity and esoteric eclecticism that shaped him, or without the seminar culture that later gave his message a new idiom. Werner Erhard cannot be understood without mind dynamics, Zen, salesmanship, performance, and the California human potential milieu. Harry Palmer cannot be understood without his years running a Scientology mission and the legal battle that preceded Avatar. The Process Church cannot be understood without its founder's passage through Scientology and beyond it into a darker, apocalyptic imagination. Freezone Scientologists cannot be understood unless one sees how a movement survives the institution that claims to own it. Still, the gravitational center remains Hubbard. If one wants to understand why so many later groups adopted levels, intensives, breakthroughs, special vocabularies, charismatic authoritative teaching, and the promise that inner transformation could be systematized, sold, and delivered, Hubbard is one of the indispensable figures. He did not create the whole culture that made such things possible, but he concentrated it into one of the most exportable packages of the 20th century. To follow that package outward, we must first go back to pulp magazines, to post-war therapy culture, to occult Pasadena, and to the moment when a science fiction writer learned that modern Americans would buy not only stories of cosmic drama, but methods for starring in them. Chapter 1. Pulp Logic and the Invention of a Mental Technology. Lafayette Ronald Hubbard was born in 1911, decades before he would become, depending on who was speaking, a prophet, a fraud, an innovator, a tyrant, a genius of organizational myth, or merely the most inventive salesman in the spiritual marketplace. The essential fact of his early adulthood was not sanctity, but writing. He came of age in the culture of pulp magazines, where speed mattered, confidence mattered, and the ability to produce copy under pressure mattered most of all. Pulp writing rewarded breadth over subtlety. It rewarded world-building, melodrama, and a kind of muscular simplification. A problem was introduced, intensified, and solved through decisive action. The writer did not hesitate, he declared. This habit of declaration never left Hubbard. It shaped his later religious prose as surely as it shaped his fiction. In the pulps, he learned how to talk like a man who had already seen farther than the rest of the room. He learned how to frame a human situation as if it were the surface manifestation of a larger hidden war. He learned, too, that readers liked systems. A thrilling premise became even more compelling when it suggested an entire universe behind it. Long before Scientology's bridge, Hubbard knew how to make a reader believe that one text led naturally to another, and that a larger revelation was always waiting beyond the current installment. Hubbard's transition from fiction to mental technology did not occur in a vacuum. The early 20th century United States was saturated with projects of self-improvement and mind cure. New Thought had popularized the idea that thought could shape reality. Popular psychology had made the language of repression, trauma, suggestion, and hidden motivation available far beyond the clinic. Hypnotism and abreaction therapies circulated in both serious and sensationalized forms. During and after World War II, public concern about trauma, neurosis, psychosomatic illness, and emotional maladjustment made the promise of mental repair newly urgent. At the same time, science carried immense prestige. To call something a technology was not merely to describe it, it was to place it on the winning side of history. Hubbard saw the opening. In 1950, he published Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, and the title alone was a performance of authority. It did not propose reflection. It did not suggest prayer. It did not invite philosophical modesty. It announced a science. It claimed modernity. It implied that the human mind, like an engine or radio, could be mapped, repaired, and optimized. Hubbard's key category was the engram, a mental recording of pain and unconsciousness that supposedly distorted human behavior. The remedy was auditing, a guided procedure through which a subject would revisit traumatic experiences and thereby strip them of their power. The prize was clear, a state in which the mind would supposedly be freed from the irrational burdens of those recordings. This was not simply another self-help scheme, it was a cultural synthesis. Hubbard combined the therapeutic confessional atmosphere of popular psychology with the procedural authority of science and the promotional energy of mass culture. Dianetics promised not only relief from suffering but increased intelligence, emotional control, and access to latent human potential. It offered a way of narrating one's pain while also treating that pain as a technical problem. This combination was deeply attractive in a society that wanted healing without old-fashioned piety and mastery, without the slowness of psychoanalysis. The initial reaction was explosive. Readers, hobbyists, seekers, and local groups organized around the new method with astonishing speed. For a brief moment, Dianetics looked like the next great American therapeutic revolution. Yet the very speed of its spread exposed its fragility. Medical and scientific authorities criticized Hubbard's claims. Demonstrations failed to confirm the more extravagant promises. Internal conflicts and financial instability followed. Hubbard's movement entered the familiar cycle of charismatic innovation: dramatic launch, ecstatic expectation, hostile scrutiny, schism, improvisation. But the failure of Dianetics as accepted science became the condition of possibility for Scientology as religion. Hubbard discovered something crucial. He had not merely created a therapy, he had created a community of people who wanted progressive revelation. They did not only want to be relieved, they wanted to ascend. They wanted a cosmology adequate to the grandeur of the claims. If the mind could be cleared, then what exactly was the mind? If trauma persisted across time, then what was the time depth of the self? If human beings were not merely maladjusted organisms but beings with hidden power, then what was their true identity? Once those questions were asked, Dianetics was no longer enough. A science of the mind could become a map of the soul. A therapeutic technique could become a spiritual ladder. A method of removing pain could become a total explanation of the universe. Hubbard's genius, whatever else one says about him, was that he sensed the exact moment at which a therapeutic innovation should become a revelation system. He understood that modern people often wanted religion in the grammar of science. They wanted transcendence without having to surrender the aura of technique. They wanted liberation as a procedure. And they wanted a founder who could sound not like a saint repeating ancient truths, but like an engineer unveiling the next model. It is tempting, in hindsight, to treat Hubbard's confidence as mere bluster, but bluster alone does not found enduring movements. What Hubbard possessed, in addition to audacity, was a sharp intuition about the desires of seekers in post-war America. He recognized that many people would accept discipline if it came disguised as liberation. They would accept jargon if it carried the smell of precision. They would accept escalating costs if each stage suggested they were nearing a breakthrough unavailable to outsiders. And they would accept a highly personalized path if that path was presented as an objective technology. In that sense, Dianetics was the prototype not only for Scientology, but for a wider family of later movements. It offered the first version of the portable package: confession as method, trauma as hidden cause, liberation as technical breakthrough, and the founder as the unique cartographer of the invisible terrain. Later groups would alter the language. Some would strip away the thetans and intergalactic myths. Some would soften the authoritarian edges. Some would place the work in seminar rooms rather than auditing rooms. But the core pattern, the promise that transformation could be routinized, taught in stages, and sold as a repeatable procedure, was already present. Dianetics also introduced something else that would matter enormously in later descendants and analogues: the conversion of personal suffering into evidence that one had not yet completed the process. If a technique promises total freedom, then distress no longer disproves the system. It proves only that one has more work to do. This logic, familiar in many therapeutic and religious settings, became central to Hubbard's system. Every frustration became a sign that the next step was necessary. In practical terms, that meant the path could expand indefinitely. And so the road opened from a self-help bestseller to an all-encompassing movement. The transition would not be seamless. It would require institutional invention, doctrinal expansion, strategic rebranding, and the transformation of a controversial author into the founder of a church. But the essential ingredients were already on the table. Hubbard had discovered that many modern Americans were prepared to believe in salvation if salvation came with charts, procedures, case studies, and the promise of an operating manual for the self. Chapter 2. From Dianetics to Scientology. The Church of Scientology was founded in 1954, but the road to that moment had already revealed the central pattern of Hubbard's career: collapse, reinvention, escalation. Dianetics had arrived with the arrogance of science and the volatility of revivalism. When it failed to secure a stable place within established medicine or psychology, Hubbard did not retreat. He changed the frame. If the world would not recognize his discovery as science, then he would enlarge the discovery until science itself looked too narrow to contain it. Scientology began where Dianetics could no longer hold. The human being was no longer just an organism with reactive mental recordings. He or she was a thetan, an immortal spiritual entity with a history far older than the present life. The therapeutic became cosmic. Auditing remained central, but what it addressed expanded. Memory was no longer merely biographical. It stretched into past lives, hidden traumas, and the spiritual degradations of immense stretches of time. Hubbard's system became not merely curative, but ontological. It claimed to explain what a person was. This change accomplished several things at once. First, it immunized the movement against many ordinary standards of verification. Claims about invisible spiritual entities, ancient histories, or confidential higher-level materials could not be tested in the same way as claims about simple therapeutic outcomes. Second, it made the system inexhaustible. There could always be another level, another revelation, another hidden cause, another layer of case to be handled. Third, it gave Hubbard a vastly enlarged narrative space. The same man who once wrote fiction could now author an unfolding sacred universe in which each course, lecture, and bulletin extended the map. Scientology's structure is often described through the image of the bridge to total freedom, and the metaphor is revealing. A bridge implies passage, stages, direction, and authority. One does not invent a bridge while crossing it. One follows the design laid out by someone else. This was a crucial innovation. The movement offered not merely inspiration, but sequence. One advanced through training, auditing, classifications, grades, and eventually the higher operating thetan levels. In such a system, progress could be measured, narrated, and institutionalized. Auditing itself became one of the most portable inventions in Hubbard's repertoire. It was part counseling, part confession, part guided memory work, part ritualized interview, and part performance of technical authority. The E-meter, eventually central to Scientology practice, dramatized the claim that spiritual and psychological states could be measured. Even when its scientific status was disputed or rejected, the device exerted social power. Instruments confer seriousness. They create asymmetry. The operator appears to know something the subject cannot fully see. This pattern, subjective revelation disciplined by procedural technique, would echo in many later groups, including those that abandoned the device but retained the interpersonal logic. Scientology also sharpened Hubbard's antagonism toward psychiatry and the mental health professions. This antagonism was not merely rhetorical. It helped define the movement's identity by establishing an adversary. Hubbard positioned Scientology as both rival and correction to psychiatry, claiming that mainstream mental health practice was destructive, corrupt, or spiritually blind. This hostility had strategic value. It recast criticism as proof of the old order's resistance to a superior technology. It also strengthened the insider identity of adherents. They were not merely clients in a program, they were participants in a struggle over the authority to define the human person. Institutionally, Scientology became more sophisticated and more demanding than Dianetics had been. A religion can ask more of people than a self-help trend can. It can organize belonging, it can sanctify sacrifice, it can transform money spent on courses into spiritual investment, it can explain hardship as evidence of significance. Scientology combined these capacities with the managerial instincts of a bureaucracy and the dramaturgy of a secret order. It multiplied policies, ethics conditions, specialized roles, internal language, and training requirements. Hubbard did not simply reveal truths. He constructed an environment in which those truths could be administered. For outsiders, this environment often appeared labyrinthine and coercive. For insiders, it could feel ordered, purposeful, and profoundly meaningful. Here again, Scientology anticipated later movements. It showed how a system could convert existential confusion into progress markers. It showed how a leader's writings could function as both scripture and policy manual. It showed how a path of liberation could become inseparable from an institution's revenue model without ceasing, for believers, to feel sacred. And it showed how secrecy could be marketed not as exclusion, but as protection. Certain truths were withheld because one had to be prepared for them. The shift from Dianetics to Scientology also changed the emotional tone of the enterprise. Dianetics had the feel of a popular breakthrough therapy, something that might sweep the culture like a new cure. Scientology had the feel of a world. It offered cosmology, anthropology, ethics, pedagogy, and hierarchy. In it, one could work on oneself, belong to a select group, and inhabit a vast story about spiritual captivity and recovery. Hubbard's background in science fiction mattered here, not because Scientology is reducible to fiction, but because Hubbard knew how to create scale. He knew that a system becomes more gripping when individual struggle is nested inside cosmic conflict. Yet the movement's later influence did not require people to accept its full cosmology. This is an essential point. Much of what traveled from Scientology into other groups was not its whole doctrinal package, but its structure of transformation. Later founders could take the ladder without the thetan, the confessional technique without the e-meter, the staged breakthrough without the intergalactic myth, the founder-centered charisma without the church architecture. Scientology thus functioned both as a specific religion and as a prototype for a more general style of modern salvation. To see why that style traveled so well, one must notice what Scientology fused together. It fused the prestige of technology with the drama of initiation. It fused therapeutic speech with sacred hierarchy. It fused individual self-improvement with totalizing explanation. It fused American entrepreneurial energy with esoteric secrecy. Above all, it fused charisma with repeatable format. The great problem of any charismatic movement is succession. Not only succession after the leader's death, but succession from one encounter to the next. How does the revelation continue to feel real after the first thrill? Hubbard's answer was to routinize charisma into courses, grades, policies, and training routines. Revelation became something one could schedule. This routinization made Scientology unusually exportable. A later founder did not need to imitate Hubbard's theology in order to borrow his method. It was enough to understand the deeper grammar, that people could be led through emotionally intense processes while being told they were participating in something objective, that specialized vocabulary could create identity and sharpen dependence, that levels could convert ambiguity into advancement, and that a movement could survive criticism by interpreting criticism as proof of its importance. By the late 20th century, these insights would appear far beyond the walls of Scientology itself. Some would appear in overtly spiritual organizations. Some would appear in seminar rooms with no overt religion at all. Some would appear among dissidents who insisted that Hubbard had been right, but the institution had gone wrong. The story of those descendants begins, however, with one more detour into the occult and initiatory world that intersected with Hubbard, before Scientology found its final form. Chapter 3: Crowley, Parsons, and the Occult Question. Few subjects in Hubbard studies produce as much heat and distortion as the question of Aleister Crowley and the occult. The temptation is strong on both sides. Critics sometimes want to explain Scientology by reducing it to occult leftovers. Defenders or minimizers sometimes want to sever the connection altogether, as though Hubbard's contact with that world were merely colorful trivia. Neither position is satisfactory. The historical contact is real. The extent and exact character of the influence are debated. What is not seriously in dispute is that Hubbard moved for a time in Jack Parsons' orbit and participated in the environment of the Pasadena Ordo Templi Orientis, the Thelemic order associated with Crowley. Parsons was one of Crowley's most ardent American disciples, a scientist who lived without embarrassment in two modern myths at once, engineering and magic. Hubbard lived in Parsons' house in Pasadena in 1945, and in the spring of 1946 he and Parsons were involved in the so-called Babylon working, a series of rituals aimed at invoking or incarnating the Thelemic goddess Babylon. These episodes belong not to rumor, but to documented history. But what follows from that fact? Crowley himself never became a direct hidden author of Scientology. Hubbard did not simply rebrand Thelema. Scientology is not an OTO in disguise. At the level of doctrine, there are obvious differences. Hubbard would later build a system that emphasized technical control, spiritual rehabilitation, and a quasi-scientific vocabulary very different from Crowley's symbolic and ritual style. Even so, it would be naive to imagine that Hubbard passed through the world of Parsons and Crowley without learning anything from it. One lesson concerned hierarchy. Dianetics, in its earliest public phase, still carried some of the democratic air of a therapeutic method one could learn and practice in ordinary settings. Scientology, by contrast, developed increasingly stratified access. There were grades, advanced teachings, confidential materials, and a sense that each level prepared the initiate for truths that could not be handled prematurely. Such structures are not unique to occult orders. They are common across religions and esoteric systems. But Hubbard had now seen a dramatic modern version of how such structures could function. Another lesson concerned secrecy. Secrecy is not only concealment, it is theater. It produces value by withholding. It creates the sensation that truth is not merely unknown, but protected. In Hubbard's later system, confidential materials, restricted higher levels, internal classifications, and carefully ordered training all helped generate the feeling that one was moving inward. Even when the content differed radically from Crowley's, the experience of staged revelation bore a family resemblance to esoteric initiation. A third lesson concerned the founder's position. Crowley, for all his contradictions, had perfected the modern occult role of the transgressive revealer, simultaneously prophet, anti-bourgeois provocateur, and source of a living corpus. Parsons played the charismatic disciple scientist who fused technical brilliance with spiritual extremity. Hubbard would later perform a different but related role. Not the scandalous magician, but the discoverer whose writings formed an ever-expanding canon and whose authority suffused policy, doctrine, and practice. The style changed. The centrality of authored revelation remained. The occult question also matters because it complicates the often repeated claim that Scientology can be understood solely as a secularized therapy gone rogue. Scientology emerged from Dianetics, yes, but it did not move only in the direction of psychology. It also moved toward a distinctively Western esoteric pattern, hidden truths, ascending levels, a specialized symbolic vocabulary, privileged texts, and a promise that ordinary humanity is a damaged version of a more powerful original condition. In this respect, Scientology resembles not only therapeutic culture, but the broader lineage of modern esotericism. Still, caution is essential. Similarity is not identity. One can overstate the Parsons-Crowley connection and end up flattening the real novelty of Scientology. Hubbard's anti-psychiatric campaigns, his training bureaucracy, his language of technology, and the specifically Scientological universe of auditing, thetan, tone scale, and operating thetan levels all take us beyond Crowley. More precisely, they show how occult and therapeutic motifs could be refashioned within a distinctly American mid-century idiom. If Crowley provided one type of hidden knowledge, Hubbard reissued hidden knowledge as a technology package. The passage through Parsons' world also illuminates something else about Hubbard. He was attracted to ambitious total systems. He preferred not small piety but grand architecture. The appeal of such systems lies in their refusal of loose ends. The self is explained, suffering is explained, history is explained, the enemy is named, advancement is charted. Hubbard's later religious construction bears this mark strongly. Whether he learned it from the pulps, from occult orders, from mass politics, from sales, or from all of them at once, he clearly understood the intoxicating social power of a complete explanatory world. In later years, observers would argue about how much Crowley mattered to Hubbard, because they were really arguing about what kind of thing Scientology is. Is it fake science? Is it a new religion? Is it an occult order translated into managerial language? Is it a therapeutic corporation that became a church? The unsatisfying but accurate answer is that it is all of these to some degree. Scientology is not reducible to any one source because Hubbard's real achievement, if achievement is the right word, was synthesis. He took pieces from multiple modern repertoires and assembled them into a system at once familiar and bizarre. That synthetic power helps explain why later movements could borrow from Scientology so selectively. A founder who wanted the initiatory ladder but not the occult symbolism could find it there. A seminar entrepreneur who wanted emotional breakthrough and staged advancement but not interplanetary cosmology could find it there. A spiritual teacher who wanted the authority of technical process without the stigma of conventional religion could find it there. Hubbard's system, shaped in part by the atmosphere of occult Pasadena, eventually became useful to people who had no desire to reproduce Crowley or Parsons at all. The occult question, then, is best handled neither as a debunking trick nor as an irrelevant curiosity. It matters because it reveals the depth structure of Scientology, a movement that clothed spiritual ascent in technical language while retaining many of the social functions of esoteric initiation. Once that is seen, the later story becomes clearer. The descendants and analogues of Scientology often do not inherit its full mythology. They inherit its social technology of hidden advancement. Chapter 4. The Portable Components of Scientology. If one wants to understand how Scientology influenced so many later groups, religious, quasi-religious, therapeutic, and corporate, one must stop thinking only about doctrine and start thinking about portability. What did Scientology contain that could be detached from the church and reused elsewhere? The first portable component was the staged path. Hubbard's system divided transformation into levels. One did not simply convert, one progressed. This matters more than it first appears to. A staged path solves several problems for a movement founder. It gives newcomers a manageable first step. It gives veterans a reason to stay. It creates an internal status order. It allows revenue to scale. It converts uncertainty into narrative. If you feel different, you are progressing. If you do not, you need the next stage. The ladder is psychologically, socially, and economically elegant. The second portable component was the auditing model, structured self-disclosure under the supervision of someone who claimed access to a more objective framework. Auditing was never just talking. It was talking inside a controlled asymmetry. The subject supplied material, but the process belonged to the system. This structure would prove immensely adaptable. Later groups could replace the e-meter with confrontation, guided visualization, dyadic exercises, or seminar breakthroughs, but the underlying appeal remained. One's hidden impediments would be uncovered through a method administered by trained personnel. The third portable component was technical language. Scientology did not merely possess jargon in the ordinary sense that all organizations do. It used language to reorganize experience. Words such as clear, engrams, ethics, tech, tone level, and operating thetan did more than label concepts. They created a new cognitive map. To speak the vocabulary was to inhabit the world. Later descendants and analogues would imitate this move even when they abandoned Hubbard's terms. Breakthrough, completion, integrity, possibility, seminar, context, resurfacing, awareness. These later terms often performed a similar function. They condensed method, aspiration, and identity into repeatable speech. The fourth portable component was the emotional choreography of breakthrough. Scientology offered not merely intellectual assent, but felt transition. One was expected to experience gains, relieves, insights, releases, shifts. The promise of subjective transformation was central, and its public narration reinforced the movement's authority. This proved highly exportable. Seminar culture in particular learned how to engineer exhaustion, confession, confrontation, relief, group reinforcement, and redescription in ways that generated memorable turning points. The cosmology might change. The breakthrough theater remained. The fifth portable component was founder centrality. Hubbard's writings and lectures saturated the movement. He was not just first teacher, but continuing authority. This, too, traveled. Many later groups in his orbit or partial orbit revolved around founders who combined pedagogy with revelation. Paul Twitchell became the Mahanta and living figure of spiritual authority in Eckankar. John Roger became the traveler teacher at the center of MSIA's world. Werner Erhard became the catalytic voice of EST. Harry Palmer became the origin point of Avatar. The Process Church revolved around Robert de Grimston and Mary Ann McLean. Independent Scientology, Freezone groups, and Ron's org all took Hubbard himself as the founder to be recovered from the allegedly corrupted institution. In every case, the founder did more than instruct. The founder embodied access. A sixth component was the management of secrecy and specialness. Advanced knowledge was not for everyone at once. One had to be ready. This structure creates depth. It also protects the movement against the flattening effect of casual exposure. Later seminar groups often presented themselves as open and secular, but they retained softer versions of this economy. Participants were encouraged not to spoil exercises in advance. Certain insights were framed as experiential rather than discussable. One had to go through it. The movement preserved value not only by teaching content, but by controlling the conditions under which the content became meaningful. A seventh and often overlooked component was the ability to relocate religion into non-religious settings without losing intensity. Scientology itself insisted, in various ways, on its religious status, but many of its methods could be secularized. Once stripped of thetans and the Xenu materials, the core experiential structure could be repackaged as personal development, executive training, communication improvement, leadership, or life mastery. This made Hubbard's influence especially potent in the human potential movement, where explicitly religious claims were often softened in favor of transformation language that seemed modern, practical, and universal. These components explain why later groups could differ so dramatically in style while still feeling like relatives. Some inherited direct personnel links, others inherited mediated forms. Still others absorbed the pattern indirectly through seminar culture. The essential point is that Scientology generated a toolkit. Not everyone used every tool, but enough of them did that a family resemblance emerged across otherwise disparate organizations. What tied the family together was not uniform doctrine, but a shared answer to a modern question: how can spiritual or psychological transformation be made systematic? Hubbard's answer was one of the most influential, not the only one, certainly. He shared the century with psychoanalysis, encounter groups, new thought, humanistic psychology, Zen adaptations, behaviorism, and countless self-help ventures. But he gave one especially forceful answer: make transformation progressive, procedural, measurable in its own terms, expensive enough to signal seriousness, verbally distinctive enough to create identity, and charismatic enough to keep ordinary life looking thin by comparison. Once that formula existed, it could be repeated in many keys. Some founders spiritualized it, some secularized it, some softened it, some hardened it, some made it mystical, some made it corporate, some made it anti-church. But the portable architecture remained. The history of Hubbard's influence is therefore less like the spread of a single doctrine than the spread of a particular style of remaking people. The rest of this narrative follows that style outward, beginning with a figure whose case illustrates both direct connection and mixed inheritance: Paul Twitchell, the founder of Eckankar. Chapter 5. Paul Twitchell, Eckankar, and the Art of Spiritual Reassembly. No case in this genealogy is more instructive than Eckankar, because no case better demonstrates the danger of oversimplification. To say that Eckankar was influenced by Scientology is true. To say that Scientology explains Eckankar is false. Paul Twitchell's movement emerged from a much wider field that included Santmat, Radhaswami materials, the language of hidden masters, and multiple currents of 20th century esotericism. Yet Scientology was undeniably one of the systems through which Twitchell passed, and its organizational and rhetorical influence helped shape what he later built. Twitchell was a seeker in the older American sense, an itinerant borrower, a synthesizer, a man moving through the spiritual and metaphysical marketplace of mid-century America. He encountered and used traditions rather than submitting passively to a single one. This made him both inventive and controversial. Scholars and critics have long noted the extent to which Eckankar drew material from prior sources, especially Santmat and Radhaswami. David Christopher Lane's work on Twitchell remains indispensable here, precisely because it shows how extensively the new movement recycled earlier teachings while presenting them under new authority. But the story does not end there. Twitchell also had documented ties to Scientology, including service as a staff member. Why does that matter? Not because Eckankar simply copied Hubbard's doctrine. It did not. Its dominant imagery moved in a different direction. Inner sound and light, the living Ekmaster, soul travel, the subtle planes, and the drama of the Mahanta, yet movements are shaped not only by doctrines, but by forms. Scientology offered Twitchell a model of how a founder could build a graded path, cultivate a specialized vocabulary, establish a self-referential textual world, and position himself as the indispensable guide through hidden levels of reality. Eckankar would take these formal possibilities and place them inside a more overtly mystical and devotional cosmology. In Twitchell's hands, the American seeker's hunger for practical spirituality became a system of initiation, discourses, exercises, and ascent. Like Hubbard, he understood that seekers wanted more than ideas. They wanted sequence. They wanted the assurance that there was a path and that the path had a custodian. A religion of direct experience, if it is to survive its first generation, often ends up institutionalizing that experience. Eckankar did this through correspondence courses, ranks, spiritual exercises, and an authority structure centered on the living master. The result was not Scientology, but it was recognizably another example of the modern package path. Early Eckankar writings also reveal an appetite for synthetic confidence. Twitchell wrote like a man bringing together a hidden tradition and revealing its practical method for modern aspirants. This tone has affinities with Hubbard's declarative style, though the emotional coloring differs. Where Hubbard often sounded like an engineer of salvation, Twitchell sounded more like a mystic organizer of secret wisdom. Still, both projected certainty, both expanded through authored texts, and both made the founder's voice central to the movement's coherence. Scientology's influence on Eckankar is therefore best understood at the level of institutional modernity. Hubbard had shown how an esoteric or therapeutic idea could be transformed into a scalable organization with stages, classes, insider language, and ongoing revenue through spiritual progress. Twitchell did not need to imitate Hubbard line by line to absorb that lesson. He could translate it into a gentler, more devotional, and more Easternized register. Eckankar's rhetoric of soul travel and spiritual masters may appear, at first glance, far removed from Scientology's quasi-scientific tone, but both movements satisfy a similar modern desire to make transcendence navigable. This navigability is what makes Eckankar especially important for the larger story. It became, in effect, a relay point. Through Twitchell, certain structural possibilities that had also been present in Scientology passed into another movement that was less combative, more overtly mystical, and more attractive to seekers wary of hard-edged technology language. That mattered for later developments because some movements, especially MSIA, came into relation with Eckankar more directly than with Scientology. In such cases, Hubbard's influence is present but refracted. The line of descent is not straight, but it is real. Twitchell's importance also lies in what he reveals about the culture that made Hubbard influential in the first place. The same post-war marketplace that allowed Scientology to flourish also rewarded figures who promised hidden truth in usable form. A charismatic teacher who could offer experience, hierarchy, textual study, and a sense of special destiny was already well positioned. Scientology was one powerful version of this formula. Eckankar was another. Where Hubbard's universe often felt like a technocratic cosmodrama, Twitchell's felt like a mystical ascent narrative. But both taught seekers to interpret spiritual life as a path of stages administered by authorized knowledge. To observe this is not to erase the major differences between the two systems. Eckankar's roots in Saint Mat and related traditions are too substantial for that. But it does mean that when one asks how Hubbard's legacy traveled, Eckankar belongs in the first rank of answers. It is one of the clearest cases in which founder involvement with Scientology intersects with the creation of a new movement that would in turn influence still later groups. And it is precisely because Eckankar functioned as a bridge that the next chapter in this genealogy matters so much. John Rogers' movement of spiritual inner awareness did not arise as a simple Scientology derivative. It emerged through a more layered history, one that includes metaphysical Christianity, ecstatic experience, contact with Eckankar, and then an embrace of seminar culture through insight. But that is exactly why it belongs in a story called 3 Degrees to L. Ron Hubbard. With MSIA, we begin to see not merely direct borrowing, but cultural relay. Chapter 6. John Roger, MSIA, Insight, and the Softening of the Ladder. John Roger Hinkins entered the American spiritual scene not as a hard-edged technician of the soul, but as a more eclectic and soothing figure. The movement of spiritual inner awareness, formally incorporated in 1971, grew out of his reported spiritual experiences, his one-on-one light studies, and his widening seminar activity in California. To understand MSIA historically, one must begin where serious scholarship begins. Not with Scientology, but with a combination of Western metaphysical Christianity, esoteric currents, and the Saint Mat/Eckankar environment that informed parts of John Rogers' vocabulary and style. MSIA is in that sense a blended movement. It is not accurate to treat it as a simple Scientology offshoot, yet it would also be misleading to leave the story there. John Rogers' larger movement, including the secular adjacent seminar enterprise of Insight, developed in a field already shaped by Eckankar, by the wider seminar culture of the 1970s, and indirectly by the structural innovations Scientology had helped normalize. The line here is neither fictional nor clean. It is a mediated inheritance. Scholars of MSIA have emphasized 3 broad strands in John Rogers' development. First, there were Western metaphysical and esoteric traditions, often Christian in coloring but heterodox in content. Second, there was the East meets West esoteric current that included Eckankar and related Sant Mat/Radhaswami influences. Third, once MSIA was established, there was the turn towards seminar and self-help culture, especially through insight. This third strand matters immensely. It marks the point at which a spiritual movement sought a broader practical language for happiness, fulfillment, and effectiveness in ordinary life. The significance of Eckankar here is obvious. If Twitchell had already translated some modern initiatory and organizational forms into a more mystical, seeker-friendly religion, then John Roger encountered not raw Scientology, but a softened and altered intermediary. The latter had already changed language. The emphasis fell less on technology and more on inner spirit, but the structure of guided ascent remained available. The founder remained central. The path remained staged. The seeker still learned through a mix of teaching, practice, vocabulary, and increasing identification with a special field of knowledge. John Rogers' genius, if one wants to call it that, was different from Hubbard's and Twitchell's. He was less interested in sounding scientific than in sounding expansive, intimate, and spiritually available. Where Hubbard's rhetoric could feel metallic and Twitchell's could feel proclamatory, John Roger often presented his teaching as a current of spirit moving through personal life. This stylistic difference is important. It made MSIA attractive to people who wanted disciplined spiritual growth without the harsher edges of either Scientology or some of the confrontational large group trainings. But softening is not the same as abandoning structure. MSIA still offered a pathway, a special language, and a founder-centered world. The movement treated spiritual advancement as something that could be cultivated by participation in teachings, seminars, and forms of guided inner work. The social logic remained recognizably modern and initiatory. The person's life was to be reframed, and that reframing required access to a teacher, a body of teachings, and an interpretive community. The emergence of insight seminars in 1977, developed by John Roger with Russell Bishop, made this dynamic even clearer. Insight was not identical with MSIA, and within the John Roger world it was not treated as simply a proselytizing funnel into the church. It was a distinct seminar format, designed in part because John Roger believed that many students still did not know how to make their lives work happily on this level. In other words, the seminar form became a bridge between spiritual teaching and practical transformation. Insight retained something of the flavor of contemporary seminar culture, while also carrying some of John Roger's own assumptions about consciousness, fulfillment, and gentle inner redirection. This is where Hubbard's influence, though indirect, becomes especially visible. Scientology had demonstrated that inner change could be routinized into a program and distributed through an organization. EST and other LGATs would secularize and dramatize that logic further. MSIA and Insight occupied a position between explicitly religious initiation and secular seminar culture. They were neither simply church nor simply workshop. They were part of what some observers have called seminar religion, a zone in which spiritual language, self-help, and organized transformational experiences blend. If Scientology's style of salvation was hard, technical, and hierarchical, then John Rogers' world softened the edges without discarding the basic insight that guided self-transformation could be systematized. Participants still entered a managed environment. They still learned to reinterpret their lives through a movement-specific vocabulary. They still encountered a charismatic teacher at the center. They still moved through experiences designed to produce release, meaning, and renewed commitment. The differences are substantial, but the family resemblance is not imaginary. Insight, moreover, sat inside a larger Californian ecosystem where EST, Lifespring, Mind Dynamics, and other programs were teaching Americans to think of breakthrough as an event one could purchase and attend. The seminar room became a place where older religious functions, confession, repentance, testimony, conversion, initiation, were translated into a late modern idiom of growth. MSYA's relation to insight shows how spiritual movements adapted to that environment by creating more secular-facing arms. This again parallels, at some distance, what Scientology had already accomplished in a different register. The conversion of inner transformation into an organized training sequence. So where does MSIA belong in this genealogy? Not as a direct child of Scientology. That would miss the decisive roles of metaphysical Christianity, Sant Mat and Eckankar, but neither is it unrelated. Through Eckankar and through the seminar culture to which it later attached itself, MSIA belongs to a broader lineage in which Hubbard's innovations are part of the inherited toolkit. In the language of the title, this is where 3 degrees becomes a useful metaphor. The line is indirect, but the transmission of form is real. This mediated inheritance would become even more visible in the explicitly secularized or semi-secularized human potential world. There, the Hubbardian contribution would often be less about doctrine than about design. No figure shows that more clearly than Werner Erhard. Chapter 7. Werner Erhard, EST, and the Secularization of Technique. If Hubbard showed that salvation could be organized like a technology, Werner Erhard showed that the same core intuition could be stripped of overt religion, drenched in the rhetoric of responsibility and breakthrough, and sold to late 20th century Americans as a life-changing training. Erhard did not publicly present EST as a Scientology derivative. He drew on multiple sources, and his own myth of origin emphasized a personal realization rather than institutional apprenticeship. Yet serious reference works and sociological accounts have long noted that Erhard examined Scientology among other movements, and some scholars have gone further, arguing that EST took substantial material from it, even as Erhard declined to acknowledge participation in the church. Again, reduction would be a mistake. EST was not Scientology with better branding. Erhard also drew on Zen-inflected ideas, on salesmanship, on the atmosphere of the California human potential movement, and on the seminar environment associated with groups like Mind Dynamics. But the reason Scientology matters here is not simply biographical. It supplied an example of how one could build a repeatable transformational technology around a vocabulary, a process, and a founder's charisma. Erhard would secularize that architecture and intensify its theatrical dimension. The standard EST training became famous or notorious for its marathon duration, confrontation, strict control of the room, emotional pressure, and the promise that one could undergo a decisive shift in the very terms by which one understood life. The language differed from Hubbard's. There were no thetans and no church doctrine, but the underlying social mechanics are strikingly familiar. Participants entered a controlled environment. They submitted to an authority structure. Ordinary speech and assumptions were interrupted. New interpretive formulas were supplied. Breakthrough was expected. Testimony reinforced the process. And the training itself was represented as a kind of technology that, properly understood, could cut through the stories people told themselves. What EST secularized was not just spirituality, but initiation. The seminar room became a modern ritual chamber. The leader's abrasive style, the long hours, the fatigue, the public exercises, and the carefully managed social pressure all contributed to an experience of dramatic dislocation and redescription. Old identities were challenged. New interpretations became available. The participant emerged not as a new church member necessarily, but as someone who had gotten it, had broken through, had seen what the untrained outside world could not see. This was a brilliant adaptation for an era suspicious of conventional religion, yet hungry for transformation. Erhard gave Americans a method that felt radical without requiring belief in a supernatural dogma. He made transcendence sound like a change in context. He made conversion sound like responsibility. He made the seminar itself the event in which insight was manufactured. One can see why this proved influential far beyond its first constituency. Scientology's role in EST is therefore most usefully described as formative rather than exhaustive. Hubbard had already demonstrated the power of a founder-centered system that combined special language, procedural transformation, and escalating commitment. Erhard borrowed within a larger field, but he borrowed in a way that exposed how transferable the core structure really was. The device could be repackaged. The church could become a training. The spiritual ladder could become an experiential course. The inner impediment could become rackets, stories, or failures of responsibility rather than engrams. The point was not theological continuity. It was social and experiential continuity. The route through mind dynamics complicates and clarifies the picture at the same time. Mind dynamics was not itself a Scientology offshoot. It belonged to another line in the human potential and seminar world. But it served as a crucial relay station because Erhard was connected to it, and because it helped create the broader ecosystem from which EST emerged. What matters here is not proving that every piece came from Hubbard, but seeing how Hubbard's innovations had entered a milieu in which ambitious founders were experimenting with scalable forms of self-transformation. In that milieu, Scientology was one of the most visible prototypes. EST also preserved another crucial Hubbardian element, the asymmetry between the trained and the untrained. Participants were encouraged to see that ordinary people lived inside illusions, self-deceptions, and limiting narratives that the training could expose. This boundary between those who had undergone the process and those who had not was one of the great emotional engines of modern transformational organizations. It gave adherents a sense of distinction and urgency. It also encouraged recruitment because one wants friends and family to have access to what now seems like an obvious liberation. In this sense, EST belongs to the history of breakthrough industries. It transformed a pattern once embedded in religious initiation into a large-scale commercial format, and because it succeeded so dramatically, it became one of the great branching points in the genealogy of later LGATs. If Scientology was an influential nexus of innovation, EST was one of the primary mechanisms by which some of that innovation entered the mainstream language of self-help, leadership, and personal growth. Its influence did not end with its own seminars. In 1985, Erhard refashioned EST into the Forum, a gentler and more business-friendly format. In 1991, the intellectual property and institutional legacy was sold to employees who built Landmark Education, later Landmark Worldwide. By then, the original training had already helped shape a wider ecosystem that included Lifespring, actualizations, PSY, and other programs. In other words, EST became one of the major secondary engines through which some of the transferable logic of Scientology moved outward into American culture. To trace that secondary engine is to see how far Hubbard's shadow could stretch once stripped of its original doctrinal clothing. The next chapter follows that shadow into Landmark and the wider seminar world that EST helped normalize. Chapter 8: Landmark, Lifespring, and the Expansion of the Breakthrough Industry. The story of EST's transformation into Landmark and its influence on the broader LGAT world is a story about domestication without surrender. By the mid-1980s, the original EST format, famous for its severity and confrontational style, had become both influential and burdened by its own notoriety. Werner Erhard responded by modifying the product. In 1985, EST gave way to the Forum, a version designed to be less punishing in tone and more adaptable to changing cultural expectations. In 1991, Erhard sold the intellectual property to employees, and Landmark Education, later Landmark Worldwide, became the institutional heir. This transition matters for two reasons. First, it demonstrates how durable the underlying form had become. One could soften the style, alter the branding, and make the language more professional without discarding the central premise that guided insight could be delivered in a tightly managed group setting. Second, it shows how a charismatic founder's system can outlive its original theatrical form by becoming corporate. What began as a dramatic countercultural training matured into a globally distributed personal and professional development enterprise. Landmark's relation to Scientology is therefore 2 steps removed but still intelligible. Hubbard influenced Erhard's understanding of transformational systems. Erhard built EST. EST was revised and institutionalized into Landmark. By the time the lineage reached Landmark, much of the specifically Scientological content had vanished. What remained was the architecture, carefully designed courses, specialized speech, pressure toward recruitment, repeated testimony, and the confidence that language itself could reorganize a life. The founder's mystique no longer needed to be foregrounded in the same way. The program could now present itself as an advanced methodology. This corporate maturation of the breakthrough format had enormous consequences. It made the seminar model more socially acceptable. It allowed transformational language to enter workplaces, executive culture, and mainstream self-improvement. The movement no longer needed to call itself spiritual in order to function spiritually for many participants. It could promise better communication, leadership, effectiveness, or possibility while still delivering something very much like a conversion experience. Lifespring represents a parallel and related development. Founded in 1974 by John Hanley Sr. with others connected to the same seminar milieu, Lifespring is frequently described as an offshoot or copy of established Hanley, and Erhard had both been instructors in mind dynamics, which makes Lifespring an important node in the same broader network. Here again, the historical point is less that Lifespring was directly from Scientology than that it inherited, through EST and the LGAT environment, a set of forms that Scientology had helped make culturally available. Staged trainings, emotional breakthrough, strong group pressure, insider language, and the idea that one's current limitations were not fixed facts, but solvable obstacles once the right method had been applied. Lifespring's trainings, like EST's, became controversial for their intensity and for claims of coercive or psychologically harmful methods. Yet controversy itself became part of the cultural aura around these programs. To critics, the pressure proved manipulation. To enthusiasts, it proved seriousness. This dual interpretation had long been familiar in Scientology as well. Highly demanding procedures can be defended internally, precisely because they feel unlike ordinary life. The extraordinary promise justifies the extraordinary means. What is striking in both Landmark and Lifespring is how little overt metaphysics they required in order to reproduce functions that older religions and explicitly spiritual movements had fulfilled. They produced confession, testimony, rupture, recommitment, evangelistic recruitment, and a sense of having crossed a threshold unavailable to outsiders. The participant did not necessarily acquire a creed. Instead, he or she acquired a framework. This framework often sounded secular, but it ordered existence in a quasi-redemptive way. Your life can be transformed. Your past need not bind you. Your patterns can be interrupted. A new horizon of being is available if you commit to the process. This is why the language of 3 degrees is useful. When the lineage reaches Landmark or Lifespring, the connection to Hubbard is no longer a matter of direct founder involvement with the church. It is a matter of institutional inheritance through EST and the larger human potential marketplace. But indirect influence can be culturally more important than direct copying. Once a form is generalized, it can reach places the original religion never could. Landmark also shows how founder charisma can be translated into method charisma. Hubbard's presence remained intensely personal in Scientology. Erhard's remained strong in EST. But by the time Landmark matured, the authority of the system increasingly rested on the apparent neutrality of the process itself. Participants might know the history, but the training's legitimacy no longer depended entirely on reverence for a single prophetic personality. In this sense, the line from Scientology to Landmark tracks a larger modern pattern. Charisma first appears embodied in a founder, then becomes routinized into procedures, manuals, exercises, and institutional brands. The same routinization helps explain why so many adjacent organizations flourished. Once the breakthrough seminar became a recognizable genre, new founders and trainers could start their own versions. Some emphasized relationships, some emphasized happiness, some emphasized spirituality, some emphasized leadership or business. The genre allowed endless modulation. Beneath the variety, however, one repeatedly finds the same modern promise: transformation can be engineered. That promise is one of Hubbard's deepest legacies, even when his name disappears. For Scientology had already taught a generation of seekers, teachers, and entrepreneurs that inner freedom could be presented not as grace, not as slow wisdom, but as a deliverable technology. Landmark and Lifespring belong to the history of that deliverability. Chapter 9. Harry Palmer and Avatar. Scientology by another name, and not by another name. Among the groups in Hubbard's extended orbit, Avatar may be the clearest case of direct founder continuity paired with strategic distancing. Harry Palmer, the creator of the Avatar course in 1986, was not merely a casual reader of Scientology. For over a decade, he operated the Elmira mission of the Church of Scientology. That fact alone places Avatar in a category different from most of the seminar descendants. Palmer was not borrowing at second hand. He had lived inside the system, run an authorized Scientology franchise, and later broke away in circumstances that produced litigation and public dispute. This background makes Avatar historically significant. It reveals what happens when a founder takes the procedural logic of Scientology, discards or obscures much of the church framework, and repackages the result as a more accessible path of consciousness training. Scholars and observers have often noted the auditing-like quality of Avatar's exercises. Critics have gone further, arguing that Avatar is essentially Scientology-derived technique with a new vocabulary and softer presentation. Palmer and his organization have long preferred to present Avatar on its own terms. Here again, the most responsible approach is to distinguish between continuity and identity. Avatar is not simply the Church of Scientology under a new corporate shell. It does not officially announce itself as Scientology, and over time it clearly sought distance from that origin. Yet the founder's biography, the legal record, and the structural resemblance are too strong to ignore. Palmer had spent years administering Scientology services. The later system he developed preserved the idea that the mind contains accumulated material which can be surfaced and resolved through a specific guided process. It also preserved the conviction that consciousness can be trained through a sequential method rather than approached as an ineffable mystery. Avatar's appeal lay partly in simplification. Scientology, by the 1980s, had developed an intimidating institutional complexity, extensive bureaucracy, and a public reputation that could repel would-be seekers. Avatar offered something leaner. It promised powerful results without requiring a participant to join a controversial church or master a huge doctrinal world. In this respect, it resembles many spiritual or therapeutic offshoots that arise when a charismatic system becomes too heavy. The offshoot keeps the experiential engine and loses the weight. The name change itself signals something important about cultural strategy. Scientology carried both power and stigma. Avatar, by contrast, sounded universal, mystical, and less entangled in modern religious warfare. The language of Avatar's materials emphasized beliefs, creations, and consciousness in a manner that felt simultaneously spiritual and psychologically modern. This made the course attractive to people who wanted disciplined inner work without the institutional identity of Scientology. But such rebranding was not merely cosmetic. It also reflected a broader trend in late 20th century spiritual culture, the migration from church form to workshop form. Modern seekers increasingly preferred programs, tools, trainings, and experiential courses to inherited institutions. Avatar fits that trend perfectly. It is one of the purest examples of Scientology's social technology surviving outside the church that developed it. Palmer's case also helps clarify how influence works in practice. Influence is not only a matter of ideas, it is a matter of trained personnel carrying habits, assumptions, and procedures with them. A founder who has spent years running a Scientology mission does not need to sit down with a notebook and consciously borrow in order to reproduce structural features of the older system. Those features have already become second nature. The path, the progression, the sense that inner freedom is methodologically deliverable, the use of carefully scripted exercises, the belief that special training can reorganize one's relation to reality, all of this can be carried forward through competence alone. This is why direct ex-member or ex-staff movements matter so much in religious history. They preserve what the parent movement teaches at the level below doctrine: pacing, authority, sequencing, case analysis, testimonial reinforcement, recruitment habits, and the very feel of guided transformation. Avatar belongs to this pattern, just as Freezone Scientology and Ron's org do in a more explicit way. The difference is that Avatar turned away from public identification with Hubbard, even while retaining a recognizable family resemblance. It also illustrates something paradoxical about Scientology's legacy. The more controversial and difficult the church became, the more incentive talented insiders had to extract its portable parts and redeploy them elsewhere. One can imagine Hubbard's influence spreading not only because his system succeeded, but because it became too cumbersome, too scandal-ridden, or too institutionally rigid for certain kinds of seekers. Offshoots could claim the usable essence without the burden of the church. Avatar's placement in this genealogy is therefore straightforward. It is a first-degree case. The founder's direct Scientology involvement is established. The adapted use of auditing-like processes is widely noted. The organization's later distancing from Scientology does not erase the origin. It confirms how strategically important it became to disown or blur that origin while still benefiting from it. In a wider sense, Avatar also shows why Hubbard's influence did not depend on people liking Hubbard. Many later participants in descendant or analogous programs may never have cared about him at all. What traveled was the method of packaging self-transformation. Harry Palmer stands at the point where that package is most visibly repacked. Chapter 10. The Process Church of the Final Judgment, From Scientology to Apocalypse. The Process Church of the Final Judgment occupies a peculiar place in the genealogy because it did not secularize Scientology, soften it, or merely repackage its transformational procedures. Instead, it carried something of Scientology's disciplinary and initiatory logic into a far darker, symbolic universe. Scholars have often described the process as founded by a British couple, Robert de Grimston and Mary Ann MacLean, who came out of Scientology and first developed a system known as compulsions analysis before the movement evolved into the more famous Process Church. This history matters because it shows how a split from Scientology could move not only toward human potential pragmatism, but toward visionary religion. The Process Church did not reproduce Hubbard's doctrine. Its theology, mythology, and style diverged dramatically, eventually centering on a striking reconciliation of Christ, Satan, Jehovah, and Lucifer as great principles. Its aesthetic was apocalyptic, theatrical, and transgressive in a way Scientology generally was not. Yet the movement's roots in Scientology help explain some of its social form: intense training, disciplined identity, founder authority, and the conviction that hidden truth could be embodied by a tightly bounded group. Compulsions analysis, the early bridge between Scientology and the process, is especially revealing. It suggests that the founders were already experimenting with a method of psychological or quasi-psychological handling that translated what they had learned in Scientology into a new framework. This pattern, taking the operational core of a movement and redirecting it toward a different symbolic end, would recur in many Hubbard-adjacent formations. The process makes the pattern visible because its eventual theology was so strikingly different. There's a temptation to treat the process as an aberration, a sensational branch that tells us little about Hubbard's wider influence. In fact, it tells us a great deal. It shows that what moved outward from Scientology was not only a seminar technique, but a model of how a founder could assemble a modern religious body around specialized knowledge, trained identity, and a sense of elect status. The content could shift from technical salvation to apocalyptic reconciliation, but the underlying social technology of distinction remained. The process also underscores how schism functions in modern religious culture. A schism is not only a break, it is a creative act. Founders who leave a primary movement often differentiate themselves by intensifying what the parent only partially contained. If Scientology was already a total explanatory system, the process pushed toward an even more dramatic symbolic totality. If Scientology had already mixed psychology, religion, and hierarchy, the process radicalized the religious and mythic elements. The result was not a copy, but an inversion, a sibling that reveals, by contrast, features of the original. The cultural afterlife of the process further illustrates how modern movements mutate. Over time, the process changed, fragmented, and eventually fed into forms far removed from its beginnings, including the lineage that led to Best Friends Animal Society. This strange trajectory, from Scientology-adjacent training to apocalyptic church to animal welfare institution, reminds us that the afterlives of such movements are rarely linear. People carry pieces of a system forward even after its theology collapses or transforms beyond recognition. In the context of this narrative, the process matters less because it influenced the mainstream of self-help, and more because it shows the breadth of Hubbard's impact as a starting point. One branch of his influence fed seminar culture and commercial breakthrough, another fed independent Scientology and schismatic fidelity to Hubbard. Another, through figures like Twitchell, passed into mystical seeker religion, and another passed through de Grimston and MacLean into apocalyptic experiment. That range is part of what makes Hubbard such an important historical node. He was not merely the founder of one religion. He became, for a time, one of the great generating centers of forms that others could radicalize, secularize, mysticize, or corporatize. The process is therefore a reminder that influence is not always a matter of surface resemblance. Sometimes the most revealing descendants are those that look unlike the parent, because they expose the abstract capacities of the original system. Scientology could generate not only corporate trainings and mystical correspondence courses, but also a community of trained defectors capable of building an entirely new mythic world. With that in mind, we can now turn from those who left Scientology to build something else to those who left it in order to keep it, without the church. The next chapter follows the explicitly Scientology-derived movements that define themselves through loyalty to Hubbard, combined with rejection of the institutional center. Chapter 11: Freezone, Ron's Org, and the Battle to Keep Hubbard Without the Church. Some descendants of Scientology denied the parent. Some translated it into a new idiom. Some took only its techniques. But another class of descendants did something different. They insisted that Hubbard was right and the church had gone wrong. These are the movements and networks most properly described as independent Scientology-derived bodies: Freezone Scientology, Ron's Org, and the wider world of independent Scientologists. Historically, these groups matter because they reveal what happens when a charismatic founder's teachings become more authoritative for certain believers than the institution built to guard them. Schism is almost inevitable in such circumstances, especially after the founder's death or during periods of organizational upheaval. In Scientology's case, the crises around the early 1980s, including the mission holders' schism and other internal shakeups, helped create the conditions for independent and non-church formations to flourish. Tens of thousands of people left or were pushed out over the decades. Not all of them abandoned Hubbard. The term free zone itself came to designate a subculture of Scientologists outside the official church. These were people and organizations that retained Hubbard's beliefs and practices, but rejected the authority of Church of Scientology leadership. Free Zone Scientology was therefore not a new theology so much as a claim of continuity. The logic was simple and powerful. The current church had deviated, become corrupt, or betrayed Hubbard's true intentions. The defectors remained faithful to the original technology. Ron's Org, founded by Bill Robertson in 1984 and centered in Switzerland, became one of the best-known organized expressions of this impulse. It adhered closely to standard Scientology in many respects while also generating its own complications, including Robertson's claims about further advanced teachings. The very existence of Ron's Org shows how strong the founder's authority remained beyond the institution. If Hubbard's writings and techniques were the real sacred core, then why should the Church possess a monopoly on them? This is not just a Scientology story. It is a classic pattern in the history of religion. After the death or administrative transformation of a charismatic founder, rival groups claim to be the true custodians. The primary body says the schismatics are illegitimate. The schismatics claim they are preserving the founder's essence against bureaucratic corruption. In Scientology's case, the intensity of church discipline, including harsh treatment of defectors, likely contributed to the consolidation of these independent milieus. When a movement severs people from an institution, it can also drive them into one another's arms. Independent Scientologists, especially the more recent defectors of the 21st century, sometimes preferred that designation over Freezone, partly because Freezone could sound too closely associated with Ron's org and its particular claims. But the broader pattern remained the same: loyalty to Hubbard, rejection of the institutional church. Some independents offered auditing and training. Some met informally in study groups. Some functioned as lone practitioners or field auditors. Some became part of loose internet-enabled communities. Together, they formed a movement milieu orbiting Hubbard as primary authority without centralized control. From the perspective of this narrative, these groups represent the purest continuation of Scientology's content outside the church. They are first-degree descendants in the strongest sense. Yet they also illuminate the broader genealogy because they make visible the difference between Scientology as institution and Scientology as transferable package. Once the package existed, lectures, bulletins, auditing procedures, training routines, higher-level materials, vocabulary, ethics structures, it could circulate beyond the body that claimed ownership. The Church's attempt to control the package through legal and organizational means only underscored how separable it had become. The Freezone and independent Scientology also help explain why Hubbard's influence on other movements could remain strong even among people hostile to the Church itself. If one could sincerely believe that Hubbard's discoveries were valid while the Church was oppressive or corrupt, then the stigma attached to Scientology did not necessarily destroy the appeal of its methods. It encouraged differentiation. Some movements, like Avatar, distanced themselves more fully. Others, like Ron's org, stayed close. Still others adopted only parts of the package and buried the lineage. These explicit post-church Scientology formations also revealed the durability of Hubbard's authored canon. A movement can survive its institution when the founder has produced enough material to function as an independent textual universe. Hubbard's lectures, books, policies, and technical bulletins made this possible. In that sense, Scientology was unusually well equipped to generate a post-institutional afterlife. Believers did not need new revelation in order to continue. They needed access, organization, and mutually reinforcing interpretation. Finally, the independent Scientology world illustrates a central argument of this book-length narrative, that Hubbard's influence spread not only because people adopted his religion, but because they learned to think of transformation as a system that could be detached from organizational ownership. Once a path to total freedom is imagined as a technology, one may come to believe that anyone properly trained should be able to use it, no matter what the official church says. This technological imagination undermines monopoly, even as it creates new sects. If the Freezone and Ron's org represent the most literal continuation of Hubbard without the church, the LGAT ecosystem represents something subtler: Hubbard without the name, the theology, or the formal religious identity. To follow that branch, we return to the human potential movement and the seminar circuits through which breakthrough became an industry. Chapter 12. Mind Dynamics and the Relay Stations of the Human Potential Movement. Every genealogy has hinge figures and hinge institutions. In the spread of Hubbard-adjacent transformational culture, mind dynamics is one of the most important relay stations. It is not best described as a Scientology offshoot. It arose from a different entrepreneurial and self-improvement stream associated with Alexander Everett and the wider motivational environment of the late 1960s and early 1970s. But because Werner Erhard, John Hanley, and other influential seminar figures passed through it, mind dynamics became one of the key environments in which the techniques and aspirations of various transformational traditions were mixed, tested, and redeployed. This matters because influence in modern spiritual culture often works through ecosystems rather than simple lineages. Scientology had already shown that one could organize self-transformation around a founder, a special vocabulary, a staged process, and the promise of extraordinary results. Mind dynamics, leadership dynamics, encounter groups, Zen-inflected seminars, and other human potential experiments were simultaneously exploring adjacent possibilities. When founders moved between these settings, they carried methods with them. Thus, direct influence becomes entangled with milieu influence. A man who had examined Scientology, trained in mind dynamics, and later founded EST would not reproduce a single source. He would synthesize. Mind dynamics, therefore, belongs in the story not as a child of Hubbard, but as a chamber of transmission. It helped normalize the notion that personal growth could be sold in intensive seminar format. It trained personnel who later built other organizations. It habituated participants to the idea that consciousness, success, relationships, and perception could be transformed through structured exercises under charismatic guidance. The more such assumptions spread, the easier it became for Hubbard-like elements to circulate without acknowledgement. This is where the phrase 3 degrees becomes especially apt. Hubbard's influence on many later LGATs is often not direct. It passes through Scientology into EST, through EST or mind dynamics into later trainings, and from those trainings into still newer workshops, corporations, and spiritual secular hybrids. By the time the line reaches the third generation, the ancestry may be invisible to ordinary participants. But invisible ancestry is still ancestry. The human potential movement was fertile soil for this kind of diffusion because it prized experience over inherited doctrine. Techniques mattered more than orthodoxy. If a process worked, it could be taken up, adapted, or renamed. The social role of the founder remained strong, but the founder was also often an entrepreneur competing in a crowded marketplace. This encouraged borrowing and innovation. Hubbard had been one of the earliest and boldest competitors in that marketplace, and his example showed what could be done when charisma, method, and organization were successfully fused. Mind dynamics and similar programs also shared with Scientology an optimism about latent human capacities. The person was not treated as simply fallen or sick. He or she was blocked, programmed, limited, asleep, or trapped in old patterns. Remove the block and larger possibilities emerge. This language is not uniquely Scientological. It belongs to a much broader modern culture of potential. Yet Scientology had given it one particularly powerful expression, especially through the promise of clear and later operating thetan levels. In the human potential milieu, that promise reappeared in secularized form. Not spiritual immortality, perhaps, but a more liberated, effective, and awakened life. The seminar format intensified the promise. Ordinary religion is often diffuse, spread across repeated observances and long durations. The seminar promises concentrated change. Weekend or marathon trainings create a sense of acceleration. Participants are asked to suspend normal routines, submit to the program's rhythm, and expect sudden shifts. This acceleration is one of the reasons the format proved so contagious. It fits a culture impatient with slow maturation. Scientology had pioneered one form of accelerated spiritual technology. The LGAT world broadened the appetite for acceleration itself. As a relay station, Mind Dynamics also shows how historical accuracy requires nuance. Not every group in the later LGAT families should be described as directly influenced by Scientology. Some were more strongly shaped by EST, some by mind dynamics or leadership dynamics, some by combinations of all three. But since EST itself has credible links to Scientology, And since the wider seminar world absorbed patterns that Scientology had helped dramatize and commercialize, the indirect influence remains historically significant. It is one reason Hubbard appears again and again at the edge of movements that no longer speak his language. The next step is to look at some of those later formations more closely: PSI seminars, actualizations, summit workshops, and the broader family of mass marathon or LGAT-style organizations. Each of them represents a different degree of distance from Hubbard. Together, they show how the breakthrough industry became a self-reproducing ecosystem. Chapter 13. PS1 Actualizations, Summit Workshops, and the Ecology of Mass Marathon Transformation. By the time the large group awareness training movement matured, the form of the modern transformational seminar had become recognizable enough to generate a whole ecology of related organizations. Some of them were founded by former EST trainers. Some emerged from mind dynamics lineages. Some blended softer humanistic tones with the harder architecture of breakthrough culture. Some were later grouped by psychologists and critics under labels such as mass marathon psychology organizations. What unites them historically is not a single founder or doctrine, but a family of techniques and expectations. PSI seminars belongs to this ecology. Its lineage is usually traced through the human potential and seminar world, especially through personnel and methods linked to mind dynamics. The crucial point for our purposes is that PSI took shape in a landscape already configured by EST and by the larger commercial transformation industry. That means it inherited at minimum a seminar model that had already absorbed some Hubbard-adjacent assumptions, that deep change can be induced in group format, that language can reorganize the self, that hidden limitations can be exposed through guided exercises, and that advancement can be framed as participation in a distinct and empowering methodology. Actualizations offers a similarly revealing case. Stuart Emery, one of the early leaders of EST and later one of the founders of Actualizations, carried the seminar world forward in a softer, more relationship-oriented direction. Where EST became famous for severity, Actualizations sold warmth, authenticity, and intimacy. Yet this softening does not indicate a break from the deeper structure. The founder/trainer still stood in a role of transformational authority. The workshop still promised a reconfigured relation to self and others. The participants still entered a managed environment in which special language and exercises could generate new self-descriptions. The difference was tonal, not structural. That tonal shift is historically important. It shows how the breakthrough form could diversify without losing its recognizable core. Some seekers preferred challenge and confrontation. Others preferred support and emotional permission. A maturing seminar market learned to offer both. Scientology had already demonstrated, in its own way, that a transformational system could expand by creating multiple points of entry and differentiated products. The LGAT ecology repeated that lesson in a less explicitly religious register. Summit workshops, along with groups such as Psi World and Transformations, has often been grouped with EST and Lifespring by critics and scholars analyzing restrictive or highly influential LGAT environments. The details of each organization's lineage differ, and in some cases the evidence for direct ties to Hubbard is thin. But the grouping itself tells us something significant. By the 1970s and 1980s, a recognizable type of organization had emerged: intensive, emotionally charged, commercially sold trainings that blended encounter group methods, human potential rhetoric, testimonial culture, and strong pressures toward recruitment or deeper participation. This type had become distinct enough to be studied as a category. Categories of this kind are not genealogies by themselves, but they reveal the stabilization of form. Once a form stabilizes, influence becomes harder to trace and easier to underestimate. People move from one seminar company to another. They adapt scripts, they rename methods, they modify intensities. Participants may not know or care about prior generations, yet the shared architecture remains. Scientology was not the only source of that architecture, but it was one of the earliest and most influential systems to package confession, progression, founder authority, and technical transformation into a repeatable commercial spiritual product. The LGAT ecology multiplied the package. There's also a broader cultural significance here. The seminar organizations helped normalize the idea that a person could purchase a decisive turning point. This is perhaps one of the deepest modern shifts in the religious field. Instead of joining a tradition and undergoing slow formation, one enrolls in an event. The event is branded, scheduled, priced, and testimonialized. It may lead to further courses, volunteer structures, or life-world commitments, but its initial appeal is concentrated change. Hubbard did not invent event-based transformation, but his movement dramatized how effective a structured progression could be when combined with strong expectation and controlled interpretation. The mass marathon style also preserved something of Scientology's strange combination of intimacy and impersonality. One disclosed intensely personal material, yet within a process designed by someone else and often administered at scale. One was invited to feel uniquely seen while simultaneously being handled according to a standardized method. This tension between individual revelation and scripted procedure lies at the heart of many modern transformational organizations. It helps explain both their appeal and their critics' alarm. Participants often feel they are discovering something profoundly personal. Skeptics observe a system applying the same machinery to many people at once. This ecology also shows how far Hubbard's shadow could reach once his name disappeared behind successive generations of influence. A participant in actualizations, PS1 or summit workshops might never encounter Scientology, and yet could still be inhabiting a cultural form partly shaped by its earlier innovations. Through EST, through mind dynamics, through the larger human potential movement, the idea of technicalized transformation had become ambient. It no longer needed attribution. The same ambient quality is what makes the last cluster of cases in this narrative the most difficult. Movements such as Raelism and Heaven's Gate, where similarities to Scientology can be observed but direct lineage is difficult to prove. To approach those cases responsibly, one must shift from genealogy in the strict sense to the language of echoes, family resemblance, and shared milieu. Chapter 14. Raelism, Heaven's Gate, and the Problem of Debated Echoes. Historical responsibility requires a line to be drawn between direct descent and ambient resemblance. Up to this point, the narrative has moved through cases in which founder involvement, strong scholarly commentary, or clearly traceable institutional relay make Hubbard's influence reasonably concrete. With Raelism and Heaven's Gate, the evidence changes. Similarities exist. Observers have noted them. But a direct line of borrowing from Scientology is harder to establish. These movements therefore belong in a different part of the story, not as proven descendants, but as examples of how certain features of Scientology resonated with a broader late 20th century culture of science fiction religion, hidden knowledge, and staged transcendence. Raelism is perhaps the more obvious of the two in terms of surface comparison. Like Scientology, it presents a universe in which advanced extraterrestrial intelligence reshapes the meaning of human origins. Like Scientology, it fuses a modern or pseudo-scientific vocabulary with religious claims. Like Scientology, it places a revelatory founder at the center and offers a message that treats conventional religion as misunderstood technology or misunderstood contact with superior beings. These are genuine parallels. They help explain why journalists and observers have sometimes spoken of the two in the same breath. But parallels are not proof of influence. The 20th century contained many ways of fusing UFO motifs, technological hope, and millennial aspiration. Science fiction itself had become a shared reservoir. Popular fascination with space, contact, hidden masters, and scientifically mediated salvation was not unique to Hubbard. Raelism can therefore be read as part of a broader field of science-friendly or science-mythic new religions rather than as a direct Scientology descendant. To put it differently, Hubbard helped normalize a type, but he does not exhaust the type. Heaven's Gate presents a similar challenge. The movement led by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles is best understood through its own mixture of biblical apocalypticism, UFO lore, New Age vocabulary, and intense communal discipline. Its mass suicide in 1997 fixed it in public memory as one of the most shocking American religious tragedies of the century. Where, then, does Scientology enter the discussion? Mostly through observed resemblances, the use of levels, the cool and technical tone sometimes used to describe cosmic truth, the sense that ordinary human identity is a degraded condition to be transcended, and the general placement of salvation in a larger interplanetary or transhuman narrative. These resemblances are real enough to note, but not strong enough to anchor a strict genealogical claim. Heaven's Gate need not have borrowed from Scientology in any direct sense to resemble it. Both emerged from a cultural world in which science fiction, esotericism, and religious yearning could be combined into total explanatory systems. Both treated human beings as enmeshed in a cosmic drama invisible to ordinary society. Both granted salvific importance to special knowledge, but the pathways into those positions may be different. Why mention these debated echoes at all? Because they show the outer edge of Hubbard's historical importance. A founder's influence can spread not only through disciples and defectors, but through atmosphere. Once Scientology had become a visible example of a modern American religion built from science fiction cosmology, technical language, progressive revelation, and founder authority, it altered the field of possibility. Later movements did not need to read Hubbard closely to operate in a world partly shaped by his success. They could arrive, independently or semi-independently, at related combinations because the culture now recognized them as available. In that sense, Hubbard belongs to the prehistory of a broader transformation in new religious life. He helped establish that a religion could sound like a system manual, that cosmic history could be narrated in quasi-technical terms, and that salvation could be linked to hidden information rather than simple belief or sacrament. Realism and Heaven's Gate. Each exploited some of those possibilities, even if the direct historical lines remain uncertain. This distinction between strong lineage and ambient influence is crucial for honest history. It protects us from turning every resemblance into plagiarism and every new religion into a branch of one older tree. At the same time, it keeps us from the opposite error, pretending that once a movement lacks direct documentary borrowing, it exists in isolation. Religious cultures are atmospheres. Founders breathe them. Hubbard was one of the 20th century's most consequential manufacturers of atmosphere in the domain of modern esoteric therapeutic religion. By now, the pattern should be visible. Scientology, born from Dianetics and shaped by the occult, therapeutic, and entrepreneurial cultures of its time, generated direct offshoots, indirect descendants, seminar analogues, and broader cultural echoes. Some movements kept Hubbard close, some buried him, some absorbed his form while rejecting his church. The final task is to gather these threads and ask what, exactly, Hubbard's larger historical significance has been. Chapter 15. The MSIA Project. L. Ron Hubbard did not become historically important because millions of people accepted the entirety of Scientology. He became important because he built one of the 20th century's most transferable systems for modern salvation. That system could be believed in, borrowed from, fought over, secularized, mysticized, commercialized, and schismatized. It could become a church. It could become a seminar. It could become a correspondence course. It could become an ex-members reform project. It could become a softer mystical path or a harder apocalyptic one. It could even become, at the third degree, a set of assumptions so ambient that later participants no longer knew where the form began. This is why the phrase, the MSIA Project, is apt. Hubbard's achievement was not simply to play Messiah in one new religion, though he certainly occupied a founder role of extraordinary authority. It was to modernize Messiahship itself. He retooled the role for a culture that trusted technology more than theology, that wanted procedure more than mystery, and that preferred the language of personal optimization to the language of sin. The modern Messiah in Hubbard's hands did not simply proclaim truth. He issued methods, levels, policies, classifications, training routines, and technical bulletins. He built a system in which redemption looked operational. That operational style is the real connective tissue among the movements traced here. In Eckankar, one sees it translated into mystical ascent and the authority of the living master. In MSIA and Insight, one sees it softened into seminar religion and spiritualized self-help. In EST, one sees it secularized and dramatized into confrontation and breakthrough. In Landmark, one sees it corporatized. In Avatar, one sees it extracted from the church and repackaged by a former insider. In Lifespring, PS1, actualizations, and summit workshops, one sees it diffused through a whole ecology of trainings. In the Process Church, one sees it transformed into another kind of total symbolic world. In Freezone and Ron's org, one sees it preserved against the institution itself. The common elements are by now unmistakable. There are tiered levels or advancement stages. There are counseling or confessional techniques that resemble auditing in structure, if not in every detail. There are intensive seminar formats or emotionally concentrated trainings. There is a language of self-transformation, breakthrough, clearing, possibility realization, spirit, awareness. There are charismatic founder narratives. There is often a promise that suffering persists because one has not yet undergone the method deeply enough. And there is a conviction that the hidden impediments of the self can be systematically handled. To notice these elements is not to say every group is the same. They are not. The differences in theology, tone, ethics, organizational style, and social effect are real. Some groups become churches, some remain corporations. Some foreground mysticism, some foreground performance, some foreground practical happiness. Some are explicitly religious, some deny being religious at all. Historical accuracy requires preserving those distinctions. But it also requires preserving the structural continuities that make the larger genealogy intelligible. Hubbard's own influences help clarify why his legacy took this shape. From the Pulps, he learned confidence, serial revelation, and world building. From popular psychology, he learned the prestige of interior diagnosis and cure. From post-war culture, he learned the hunger for methods that promised repair and mastery. From occult circles around Parsons and the Crowley milieu, he encountered the social power of initiation, hierarchy, and protected knowledge. From the American marketplace, he learned that truth could be distributed like a product if it were properly branded and staged. Scientology emerged from the fusion of all those lessons. Once fused, the package became extraordinarily generative. A sociologist once remarked that some organizations function as influential nexuses of innovation and diffusion. Scientology was such a nexus. To study it solely as a controversial church is therefore to miss half the story. It was also a laboratory in which older religious forms were recoded for a modern age obsessed with mind, potential, and technique. Its afterlife is not confined to its membership roles. It is written into the wider culture of self-transformation. One way to see this is to remember how many later participants in Hubbard-adjacent movements would never willingly have joined Scientology. Yet they were drawn to descendants or analogues that offered similar structural satisfactions with less stigma or in different language. They wanted the path without the church, the breakthrough without the doctrine, the founder without the baggage, or the method without the cosmic myth. The marketplace supplied those alternatives. In doing so, it spread Hubbard's influence beyond Hubbard's brand. Another way to see it is to observe how many later movements made the same wager Hubbard had made, that people will submit to significant control if they believe the process leads to unusual freedom. This is one of the central paradoxes of modern transformational culture. The participant accepts schedule, vocabulary, authority, and often strong social pressure in order to become more fully autonomous, more aware, more free. Hubbard did not invent this paradox, but he weaponized it with unusual sophistication. His descendants inherited the mechanism, whether they admitted it or not. For historians of religion, the lesson is broad. Modern new religious movements are not always best studied as isolated islands. They are often better understood as movement milieus, in which people, concepts, practices, and symbolic forms circulate. Seekers move from group to group. Founders train in one setting and create another. Organizations splinter, dissolve, reappear, and lend pieces of themselves to yet newer bodies. In this kind of field, direct descent and ambient influence intertwine. Scientology's story is exemplary because it produced both. For cultural historians, the lesson is equally striking. The late 20th century did not simply secularize. It reinvented religion inside the languages of therapy, business, and technology. Scientology stands near the beginning of that reinvention, not as the only example, but as one of the boldest and most consequential. To follow its lines into EST, Landmark, Avatar, MSIA, Eckankar, The Process, Freezone Scientology, and the wider LGBT world is to see how porous the boundary between religion and self-help really became. And for readers trying to understand why Hubbard still matters, the answer is not only that Scientology survives, it is that Hubbard became part of the infrastructure of modern transformation culture. He helped shape how many people came to imagine inner change, not as grace descending, not as fate unfolding, not as wisdom slowly cultivated in ordinary life, but as an engineered passage through levels, insights, and controlled experiences administered by experts or founders. In that sense, the story ends where it began, in the post-war dream of conquering inner and outer space through method. Parsons represented one version of that dream, all rockets and ritual. Hubbard carried it into another register. He promised not merely belief, but operation, not merely comfort, but total freedom, not merely religion, but a technology of the spirit. Others, whether in admiration, competition, rebellion, or selective borrowing, took that promise and made their own worlds from it. Those worlds did not always remember their parentage, but genealogy does not disappear when memory does. A training room in California, a mystical discourse course, a seminar on possibility, an independent auditing session in Switzerland, a church of soul travel, a soft-spoken self-help intensive, a movement that claims to preserve Hubbard against the church itself. All are part of a larger historical pattern. The pattern is the MSIA project, the conversion of revelation into system, of charisma into process, and of salvation into something that can be scheduled, taught, purchased, repeated, and passed on 3 degrees from the original source. That is the historical meaning of Hubbard's impact. Not merely that he founded Scientology, but that he helped found a way of imagining human transformation whose descendants now reach far beyond the church that bears his name.